Hello there! It's time for another drawing video. Today we're going back to the space year of 2008 to draw some Thomas and Friends characters introduced that year and translate them into the style of the original Railway series books. We've got 3 engines to go through, so what are we waiting for? Let's get started! Stanley was introduced in The Great Discovery. Whilst Thomas was busy helping to restore the town of Great Waterton and the railway that leads to it, Stanley was brought in to help do Thomas's regular jobs. Thomas was annoyed at Stanley for getting so much attention and vowed to pay him out. As I mentioned in last week's video, Great Waterton doesn't exist within the continuity of the original books, and so if the Great Discovery were to have happened in the Railway series timeline, then it would have had to be a different line that Thomas was helping to build or restore. Recently, we got a lore drop from Richard Audrey that a new line, that runs to Ballasween via Harwick, was constructed to serve a nuclear power plant. Perhaps Thomas was chosen to help construct this line due to his prior experience. When the North Western Railway was first established, Thomas was one of the engines who had helped to build it. This is where Stanley comes in. In the TV series, Stanley's only major role was in The Great Discovery. Stanley would continue to make appearances throughout the remainder of the series, but never played any major roles and rarely even spoke. It's strange that he even got a CGI model, considering how little he did following the show's switch to CGI. It's been theorised that Stanley was going to play a major role in Hero of the Rails, the first CGI Thomas special, but that never came to be. Anyway, in this alternate universe, Stanley is brought in to help out on Thomas's branch line whilst Thomas is away helping to construct the Ballasween line. By this point there were no longer steam engines working on the British National Railway network or even in industry, so Stanley would presumably be a preserved engine. Stanley is based on an 060 saddle tank design built by Kitson and Company for Stewarts and Lloyds of Corby to work at the ironstone quarries. The owner of the company was married to a Welshwoman, and so many of the engines were named after places in Wales, albeit with anglicised spellings. All of the preserved examples have names of their own, so possibly Stanley is a fictional addition to the class who was either named Stanley from the outset or given the name later on. Perhaps he is owned by the same nondescript heritage railway in the Midlands that owned 16. But what of Thomas? Whilst he was busy building the Ballasween line, he would sometimes make trips to Tidmouth to pick up trucks containing equipment for railway construction. Occasionally Duck or Oliver would take the trucks as far as Alsborough for Thomas to collect from there, but usually they were busy with their own work and Thomas had to fetch them from the big station. When he was there he'd meet up with the mainline engines, who teased Thomas by telling him that everyone liked Stanley more than Thomas, and don't want him to return. Thomas shrugs it off at first, but then the 2 engines met at Tidmouth, and everyone was giving Stanley lots of attention. It was too much for Thomas. Later he told James at the big station to relay a message to Stanley from the Fat Controller, telling him that he needed to hitch Percy's trucks to the back of his passenger trains. Stanley would struggle with the workload. Wouldn't he look silly, thought Thomas to himself. But the thought lingered in Thomas's smokebox for a long time. He began to worry that Stanley would break down from the heavy workload and have to get sent back home. Maybe Percy would have to do Stanley's work, and what if he couldn't handle it either? Thomas wanted to tell Stanley the truth, but on his way back to the big station he failed to notice a bad bit of line and came off the rails. Who should come to Thomas's rescue the following morning but Stanley? Thomas apologised for lying about Stanley's workload and making him pull too much at a time. Stanley was confused. It turns out that James suspected that Thomas was lying and never did relay the information to Stanley. but eventually he says that if Thomas promises never to lie to another engine again, he'll help Thomas back onto the rails. Thomas, still none the wiser, agrees to this, and the two engines become friends. The Ballastwing extension was a fairly recent addition to the North Western Railway, so I figured that it would be a good time to mimic the style of Clive Spong for this drawing. I've already drawn Thomas in the Clive Spong style, so I decided to draw Stanley interacting with Percy. I've changed Stanley's design a little bit since there are elements of his TV series design that I don't think would be there if he was a book character. For starters, I've swapped out his silver smoke box for the standard black. While silver smoke boxes are sometimes a thing on American locomotives, it seems unlikely to me that a British engine would have a smoke box that colour, even in preservation. Secondly, I've made his face round. The engines that Stanley is based on have round smoke box doors, so I'm not 100% sure why his face is arch-shaped in the TV series. I guess they just wanted him to look a bit different, but since the engine's faces in the Railway series usually go in place of a smoke box door, I've given Stanley the standard round face. And so, here is the finished drawing. Hank is a character introduced in Season 12 of Thomas & Friends. I've already voiced my opinions on Season 12 before, but to reiterate, I feel as though nothing about the TV series would really change if you got rid of it. The new characters introduced never appear again, and the writing and set design feel a bit like they were done on autopilot. Hank isn't the first American engine in the world of Thomas, not by a long shot. We'd previously had Rosie in the TV series, and even in the Railway series we had the Mid-Sodor Railway Stanley, not to be confused with the TV series engine, and the two Baldwin saddle tanks which may or may not be canon. However, Hank is the first American design that flat out couldn't have worked on Sodor due to his sheer size. He is based on a Pennsylvania Railroad K4, which is much bigger than any British engine. Some people have resolved this issue in their AUs by making Hank an S160, a much smaller locomotive built by various American locomotive manufacturers during World War II for use in Europe. Personally, I didn't want to do that, mainly because I wanted to work with what I had, and in Hank's case there's not much to work with other than his appearance. His personality is fairly vague, more or less being a generic nice character like many of the newbies of this era. So, how can I make Hank work if I can't change his basis? Well, since he only appears in one episode, I figured that I could make him a non-Sodor resident, except this time he's never visited Sodor or even been within close proximity of a Sodor engine. How does that work? Well, I figured that I could have him interact with Sodor's engines in a different way. If you watch the video in which I talk about Rosie, you may remember that her driver and fireman wrote letters to her old friends at Southampton after she was relocated. So I figured, why not make Hank a pen pal of one of the Sodor engines? He could be Thomas's pen pal, since Hank shares his one Spotlight episode with Thomas, but I think he could work as a pen pal for Gordon. Not only are they both big 462 tender engines, but Gordon's designer, Sir Nigel Gresley, was heavily inspired by the PRR K4s and incorporated many elements of their design into his own 462 locomotives. In Hank's only TV series episode, Heave Ho Thomas, the conflict arises when Hank calls Thomas one of the finest little engines he's ever seen. Thomas takes offence to being called little, and tries so hard to prove himself that he overworks himself and breaks down. This could still happen in this universe where Hank is Gordon's pen pal. Maybe he gets sent a photo of Thomas, and gets his driver to write back saying how much of a fine little engine Thomas is. Thomas overloads himself trying to prove Hank wrong and learns the important lesson of knowing his limits. Next time Hank writes to Gordon, he's heard about Thomas's story and gives him some words of encouragement, making Thomas feel very proud of himself. Given that Hank is just one of the many K4s working on the Pennsylvania Railroad, I've given him a standard black livery. The funny thing is that if I'd have made him an S-160, then I could have given him his deep blue livery from the show and said he was from the Longmoor Military Railway. But with all that said, here is the completed illustration. Finally for this video, we've got Flora the steam tram. Much like Hank, Flora only had one appearance in the TV series and didn't have a particularly standout personality. In her single appearance, Flora is supposed to lead a parade alongside Toby. Thomas tries to hide her from Toby to prevent him from knowing there's another steam tram on Sodor, only for Toby to be happy to see Flora as he was too scared to lead the parade by himself, because this is the hit era and Toby was a little wimp during this period. We actually do know what Flora's job is. She's owned by Sodor Tramways and serves Great Waterton and the surrounding areas. However, as previously established, Great Waterton doesn't exist on Sodor in the railway series, so we'd need to find somewhere else for her to work. There were a few tramways on Sodor. Of course there is the Quarry Tram Road at the end of Thomas's branch line, but that's run by Toby and Mavis and previously the Coffee Pots, so there isn't really a point in the timeline when Flora could have worked there. There is also the Arlesdale Tramway, the precursor to the Mid-Sodor Railway, which maybe I could have chosen, but in the end I went with the Ballaswin Tramway. What's that, I hear you ask? Well, it appears in early maps of Sodor running between Harwick and Ballaswin. Nothing is known about it and was seemingly a concept that Wilbert Awdry abandoned, since later maps replace it with the Cronk and Harwick Railway. This line never used locomotives, so I can't assign any engines to it. However, the Ballaswin Tramway might be more canon than we'd previously thought. Like I said at the start of the video, a new line was recently constructed that serves both Harwick and Ballaswin. Perhaps it used the track bed of the old Ballaswin Tramway. So, my idea is that the Ballaswin Tramway was opened around 1900 and operated by two steam trams built by Kitson. Flora and her twin sister Clover operated the line throughout its lifespan, providing both passenger services as well as mineral trains from the Ballaswin quarries to the port at Harwick. The two engines were easily recognisable thanks to their bright yellow colour scheme. Flora isn't necessarily the most talkative engine, but she will smile and ring her bell to everyone she meets, provided that's okay with them. The Ballaswin Tramway was operational throughout the first half of the 20th century, but the steady increase in road traffic meant that the steam trams had less and less to do as the years went by. Passenger services came to an end around 1930, with the whole line being closed by 1960. By this point, Flora was the only engine left on the line. Flora was preserved, although the fact that the Ballaswin Tramway was slightly narrower than standard gauge meant that she hasn't been steamed since the closure of her old line. She has been transported to various parts of the island for heritage events, so she doesn't get too bored. But she can usually be found in one of Sodor's museums, possibly the Museum of Science and Technology that I speculated about in the Peel Godred video. With that said and done, here is what the final drawing looks like. And there you have it. A Railway Series twist on 3 more engines exclusive to the TV series. Given that the show never really did a whole lot with these characters, this one was very much a challenge, but it was great fun regardless. I hope you've had just as much fun watching it. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts, and if you're not subscribed, make sure to press that button.